You know, I do it all the time. I already know I got you, nigga. I don't even have to blink. Got you already, nigga.
There's a lot of people out there that talk about the original Egyptian people. Most of the time, people have no idea what they're talking about. Today, we're going to be exploring the Nubians and how they strongly influenced the Egyptian culture at its most formative stage from the beginning. And it was a pastoral background that links Egypt to Africa. Let's do this.
Okay, I didn't create the evidence. All I'm doing is introducing you to it. That's it. I'll let you make up your own mind.
The Upper Egyptian Nubian tradition of rock art is absent in the north, but there's plenty of it in the western and eastern deserts by the dawn of the Predynastic period. And these origins lie somewhere in the 6th millennium BC, if not earlier. We see what Mr. Darnell writes right here. All of this owes much to early traditions of Nubia and the Western Desert.
Ethiopia is the mother of Egypt. Even the rich silk came out of Ethiopia.
I've been looking this way ever since I remember, and it ain't gonna change. So I don't care what them people say. I will forever be this way. I will forever be this way.
Now, we're going to be studying an area that's right near Thebes and the Kenna Bend. If you guys know where that is, that's the heart of ancient Egypt. It's basically the main area where the original kings rose up. Mr. Darnell writes right here that there are all kinds of roads in this area that connected it with Lower Nubia. And this area was home to a mixed culture showing affinities with Nilotic, Western Desert, and Nubian cultures of the early Predynastic. Now, as we read that, let's remember that the Eurocritics spend all their time making YouTube videos and writing all kinds of papers about how everything is Caucasian all the time. Now, what we're going to do right now is explore what exactly is a Nilotic? Who is in the Western Desert? Well, what we know about the Western Desert is that from the Holocene, the Western Desert, especially Naphtha Playa, contains one of the longest and most complete sequences of Holocene occupations right there in Egypt. Fred Windorf, Romuald Schilde, Joel Irish, and the rest of their fellows wrote a paper titled Discovery of the First Neolithic Cemetery in the Western Desert of Egypt. And they've written a few papers about it. And we're going to ask ourselves today, who were the people found at this cemetery in Egypt? We see that Gebel Ramla is the first Neolithic cemetery to be found in the southwestern desert of Egypt. They were very rich, had elaborate grave goods. They were complex and also a prosperous community around the time of the mid-5th millennium BC, who are also cattle keepers. This is all contemporary with the Egyptian Badarian and Natazian in the Western Desert, which, mind you, is Nubian related. Valuable imported objects with these burials indicate an exchange of goods that reached as far as Sinai, the Red Sea coast, and equatorial Africa. You know, the mountains of the moon. But again, who were these people? Well, the clustering of the graves is perhaps composed of individuals belonging to phenotypically diverse populations derived from both North and Sub-Saharan Africa. Why is this important? Because the authors, along with many other authors, reminds us that this cemetery and its cultural affiliations offer a pre-echo of what would become the Egyptian civilization.
I didn't create the evidence. All I'm doing is introducing you to it.
So now that we know what was going on at Gebel Ramla, we now know that in the southwestern desert, At the time period that we're talking here in the pre-dynastic, it was a time of onset of structured societies with developed astronomical knowledge and cosmology that shall be later found in the ancient Egyptian civilization. And that very subject was covered right here on this channel. I have 2 videos covering that. You guys can take a look if you want to see all the details there. So we know that Nilotic people were in Upper Egypt in the pre-dynastic period. But what is a Nilotic person? Of course, a Nilotic person is people relating to the Nile River or to the Nile region of Africa, more specifically, subgroups of Nilo-Saharan languages spoken in Egypt, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, and Tanzania. The Western group includes the Luo and the Dinka. The Eastern group includes the Maasai and Turkana. And so when these guys are running around telling you about the mountains of the moon, but not telling you exactly who these people were, there you go.
Come on, that's a bunch of horse shit. Lando Calrissian was a black guy, you know. He got to fly the Millennium Falcon. What's the matter with you?
Who said that?
I did. Lando Calrissian is a positive role model in the realm of science fiction fantasy.
Fuck Lando Calrissian, Uncle Tom, nigga. Always some white boy.
The rock art near Thebes in the Western Desert clusters along established routes that provided the main avenues for trade, communication, and military maneuvers. And we see what it says right here. Some of these routes connected Upper Egypt with Nubia and provided a desert as well as a Nilotic conduit for intellectual exchange between the 2 regions. So we see here for ourselves, Nilotic people, Nile Valley Africans, participating in an intellectual exchange between Egypt and other areas right there. This all leads to intense and continuous interactions between Egypt and Nubia along the Nile Valley and through the routes of the eastern and western deserts. So by the early pre-dynastic period, the rock art that we're talking about here juxtapose desert and Nilotic images, and both of these things Niloticized and socialized the desert of Egypt. The rock art incorporated the desert margins into the ever more important world of the increasingly complex cultures of the Nile Valley. And by intertwining Nilotic and desert imagery, all of this transfers that Nilotic symbolism into the desert landscape of ritual hunting and blends together images of hunting in both worlds.
What's a Nubian?
Shut the fuck up.
So we see right here the Nilotic people mixing their imagery with the desert, creating a new symbolism there in Egypt. Mr. Darnell goes on to write in this paper that this entire situation is an unparalleled laboratory for observing and describing the development of iconographic and ultimately hieroglyphic communication systems in Upper Egypt. Now, I want you guys to notice that nothing European or Arab or any of that is being mentioned here, because there was no European in Egypt. By employing Nilotic imagery at the desert sites and consciously combining this with the river and desert motifs into a single image or grouping of images, this allows for a Niloticization of the desert, meaning that the Nile Valley Africans there were putting it down. What we end up with is these groups working at this time preserved early royal images in the Upper Egyptian desert in areas that have been identified later as originally Nubian. And at least 3 such tableaux appear at Lower Nubian sites, together with these Egyptian sites. Together with the Custal incense burner, these Nubian rock art groups are evidence for the early spread of the Gatto II and Dynasty 0 royal and ritual iconography into Nubia, which is how we have the white crown in Nubia, which is how we have pre-dynastic Nubian kings in Tasseti. We can see for ourselves right here the scorpion, the palace facade. And again, we have no evidence from Europe because no one ever heard of them at this time. Here in Cultural Entanglement, Maria Gatto tells us that the Nubian, Abkhan, and the A group cultures, as well as the Egyptian, Bedouin, and Tazian cultures, share so many elements that they can be defined as part of the same Nubian tradition. Alice Stevenson, writing right here in the Egyptian Predynastic and State Formation, tells us that by the beginning of the 3rd millennium, this is coming up on the first dynasty, the Egyptian society had transformed into what is often considered the world's first territorial state, headed by the institution of divine kingship.
Bang on that wicked ass beast daily.
But what was going on with these so-called Nubians and Egyptians at the time? Well, at that period, there was a period of cultural entanglement. In the pottery and the lithic assemblages are found both Nubian and Upper Egyptian style materials together from the dawn of Egyptian history. Not only that, there are hybrid objects displaying traits associated with both areas, right there in Upper Egypt. The reality is we get a period of cultural entanglement and fluid interaction between these communities, and eventually a more distinctive identity emerges in the course of the 4th millennium, which, as I said before on this channel, is how we get this idea of Nubians and Egyptians. And so in the pre-dynastic, we see the rise of Abydos in the Gatto 1A through B. After that, in the Gatto 1C, we see the rise of Heracleopolis. And by the end of Nagata 1C, Nagata and Abydos both shared broad categories of material culture with their southern neighbor, Heracleopolis. And I'm going to tell you right now that Heracleopolis has been described as a Nilotic city. As a matter of fact, Heracleopolis was an important place to Nubians for a long time after the first dynasty. So again here, Ms. Stevenson writes that by Nagata 3A through B, the tombs there were relatively impressive, and their prosperity is possibly attributable to relationships with the terminal Nubian A groups to the south. It was at this time that members of Nubian society were able to participate in the exchange of an elite international style. And we again see all of this being expressed with the royal iconography that is found with the Nubians at this time. So this African pastoral community that they're talking about here, it is not envisioned to have been a discrete social unit, nor is it suggested that it represents a conscious identity shared by widely dispersed groups. Rather, it is a consistent set of concepts and practices focused on the body in life and death that was shared by Nile Valley groups along a north-south axis in the 5th millennium BC. This goes hand in hand with what David Wingrove wrote a few years back in Cultural Convergence, where he reminds us that an important horizon of cultural change belonging to the 5th millennium BC links Egypt's early development firmly to that of its southern neighbors in Nubia and central Sudan. And that in itself goes hand in hand with what Ms. Gatto wrote here, that Nubia is Egypt's African ancestor, that the pastoral nomadic lifestyle is the same pastoral background commonly shared by most of the ancient Saharan and modern Black societies today. And you see what she says here. Not only did Nubia have a prominent role in the origin of ancient Egypt, it was also a key area for the origin of the entire African pastoral tradition, which brings in all African people. When Edwards in 2007 told us that considerable cultural similarities existed among the river Neolithic populations from central Sudan as far north as the middle of Egypt during the 5th millennium BC, it all makes sense now. We now have some background for that. When the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt tells us that ancient Egyptian practices show strong similarities to modern African cultures, and it all suggests an African substratum or foundation for Egyptian civilization, it makes sense now. When they tell us that the Saharan and Sudanese rock art from this time resembles early Egyptian iconography, and that strong connections between Sudanese and Egyptian material culture continue in later Neolithic Bedarian of Upper Egypt, we now have a background for that. We now have a background for when Frank Yerko wrote this right here. Among the foreigners, the Nubians were closest ethnically to the Egyptians, and in the Predynastic period, the Nubians shared the same culture as the Egyptians and even evolved the same pharaonic political structure, which itself goes hand in hand with what I've said on this channel the entire time, that the Nubians were always familiar with the Egyptians. That's why it was so easy for them to become Egyptianized later. But getting back to our conversation, everything that we've talked about so far on this video should now make sense when we read Lavelle right here. There is now a sufficient body of evidence from modern studies of skeletal remains to indicate that the ancient Egyptians, especially the southern Egyptians, exhibited physical characteristics that are within the range of variation for ancient and modern indigenous peoples of the Sahara and tropical Africa. And this evidence indicates that early Nile Valley populations can be identified as part of an African lineage, but exhibiting local variation, which again is what I've been saying the entire time on this channel. And that in and of itself goes hand in hand with what Ms. Gatto says here, that the evidence points to an earlier presence of a Nubian population in the southern part of Upper Egypt. And as a matter of fact, in the 5th millennium BC, the Tarifian, the Tazian, and the Bedarian cultures, all some of the earliest Egyptian cultures, were Nubian related. Also, the findings of the same age from the eastern and the western deserts are Nubian related. As a matter of fact, the entire cultural substratum in Upper Egypt in the Predynastic as a whole is mostly Nubian related.
What's a Nubian?
Shut the fuck up.
I've been telling you guys forever, it doesn't matter where you go in Egypt. It's all Nubian related. Nabta, at the beginning of the Egyptian group, was included in the Nubian group during the Nagata period. This includes findings in the Eastern Desert, the Western Desert, and in the southwest corner at Gilf Kabir, where the later Egyptian kings went to meet up with emissaries from the Kingdom of Yam. When we look at Egyptian pottery, the blacktop pottery is always put up as an example of this entangled culture, where we have Nubian culture and so-called Egyptian culture entangled together as a part of the same
What's a Nubian?
cultural tradition.
Bitch, you almost made me laugh.
I'm going to leave you guys with the words of Maria Gatto here. The consistent occurrence of Nubian elements in the material culture. All these things we've been talking about, the different stages at the base of this entanglement process have been detected. And again, we can take a look at Nagata red polished bowls with Nubian milled rim decorations that shows the entanglement of this culture. The growth of the elite system in Egypt during the 4th millennium created a stronger centralized control, and with the need for a more consistent presence of Nagata or Egyptian symbolism, ideology, and iconography on the ground, this is when we start seeing an Egyptian identity forming. And what happens is a standardization of the local material culture style in the favor of an Egyptian style is what takes over. And then we see less and less appearances of Nubian markers in the record. And now we have an Egyptian style rather than a Nubian style. We saw them come up with their own culture now. And this is how we end up with Egyptians. And so we see that no matter where we go or where we look at, there's always a Nubian. When people are running around here romanticizing Egyptians, romanticizing the good old days, as far as Europeans, no one knew who you were. No one knows what you were talking about. This was just a short little example of how I'm going to be smashing the Eurocritics on this channel. This is just a little bit, get you guys started. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.